the empire that swallowed the sun. Close your eyes for a moment. Breathe slowly. Let the world outside fade away. The noise, the hurry, the blinking screens. Tonight, we are going somewhere else entirely. We are stepping back 500 years to a world of cool marble corridors. The thick sweetness of rose attar drifting through open latticed windows, and the soft clink of gold coins counted by lamplight in rooms so vast the echo lived longer than the sound. We are stepping into the Mughal Empire, and into one of history's most haunting questions. Where did all that extraordinary wealth go? The Mughal Empire was not merely rich in the way we think of wealth today, a number, a percentage, a line on a chart. It was rich in a way that bends the imagination. At its height in the 17th century, the Mughal Empire produced roughly a quarter of the entire world's economic output. Think about that for a moment. One empire, one quarter of the world. It was a civilization that had mastered trade, agriculture, artisanship, and architecture to a degree that left European visitors breathless and occasionally speechless. Travelers who arrived at the Mughal court often struggled to find adequate words in their own languages to describe what they were seeing. The Emperor Akbar, one of the greatest rulers the world has ever known, built a palace city called Fatehpur Sikri out of red sandstone in the Rajasthan plains. Then, later, abandoned it, whole and intact, for reasons historians still debate. Shah Jahan, grieving and sleepless after the death of his beloved wife, Mumtaz Mahal, channeled his loss into stone and commissioned the Taj Mahal, a building so meticulously beautiful it feels less like architecture and more like a prayer made solid. Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughal emperors, presided over an empire so enormous it strained the very capacity of any single human being to govern it, and then, rather quickly. By the standards of history, much of it was gone, not gradually faded, the way some empires do, growing thinner and quieter over centuries until they are more memory than reality. No, the Mughal Empire's wealth moved differently. It was extracted, scattered, seized, hidden, lost, and in some cases melted down or broken apart until its original form was unrecognizable. The British East India Company arrived not simply as traders, but as an economic force that systematically redirected the wealth of the subcontinent. By the time the British Crown took formal control in 1858, the process was well advanced. Treasuries that had once staggered visiting diplomats were diminished or empty. Jewels that had graced the throats of emperors glittered instead in the vaults of London. But here is the thing that keeps historians, archaeologists, and dreamers awake at night. Not all of it was found. Not all of it was taken. Some of it slipped through the cracks of history entirely. There are rooms rumored to be buried beneath old forts. There are rivers said to have swallowed chests of coin during panicked flights from advancing armies. There are jewels whose trails go cold in the historical record, appearing once in a court inventory and then simply vanishing. There are objects so embedded in legend that separating fact from story is like trying to untangle silk thread from water dot over the course of this evening. We are going to follow those trails together. We are going to sit with the mystery, turn it over gently, look at it from different angles. We will talk about specific treasures, some legendary, some documented, some somewhere in between. We will talk about the people who hoarded them and the people who seized them, the accidents of history, and the deliberate acts of plunder that moved the wealth of a civilization across oceans. We will walk through the halls of the Red Fort, where Shah Jahan once held court beneath jeweled canopies. We will follow the Peacock Throne, perhaps the most extraordinary seat of power ever constructed, as it was carried away into Persia by a conquering army, and then trace what happened to it after that, piece by piece. We will follow the Koh-i-Noor diamond from the mines of Golconda, through rivers of blood and politics, all the way to the crown jewels of Britain, where it still sits today, its history both brilliant and troubling. We will look at the lesser-known stories too, the provincial governors who buried their treasuries rather than surrender them, the princesses who sewed pearls into the linings of their garments as they fled, the merchants who vanished into the countryside with cartloads of gold during the chaos of the empire's collapse. History is not only the story of the powerful, it is also the story of the terrified and the clever and the quietly determined. And we will ask the question that sits underneath all of this, soft as breath: is any of it still out there? The honest answer, supported by historians and the occasional archaeological discovery, is yes, probably, not all of it, and perhaps not the grandest pieces. But the Mughal Empire was so staggeringly wealthy, its reach so vast, its treasuries so numerous, that it would be statistically extraordinary if every last jewel and every last coin and every last piece of art had been accounted for. History has a way of losing things, even enormous, glittering, golden things. So tonight, let yourself settle in. There is no hurry here. The story does not demand anything of you except your attention, your imagination, and a willingness to wonder. We are going to move slowly, the way history deserves to be moved through, not at a sprint, but at a thoughtful walk, pausing where things are interesting, sitting with what is strange, or sad, or astonishing. If this is the kind of story that speaks to you, and I suspect it might be, since you're here, I'd love to know what draws you to it. Is it the history, the mystery, the quiet thrill of wondering what might still be buried somewhere beneath the earth? Leave a thought in the comments if you feel moved to. But for now, breathe out and let us begin. The Throne of Thrones, the Peacock Throne and its disappearance. Imagine you are standing in the Dewan-i-Khas, the hall of private audience, inside the Red Fort in Delhi. It is 1648. The air smells of incense and fresh flowers. The floor beneath your feet is cool white marble inlaid with intricate patterns of precious stones. Light falls through carved stone screens, laying soft geometric shadows across the ground, and at the far end of the hall, elevated on a low platform, surrounded by courtiers in silk and gold, sits something so extraordinary that it has no real comparison in the history of human craftsmanship. The Peacock Throne. Shah Jahan commissioned it in 1628. The same emperor who would later build the Taj Mahal. The throne took 7 years to complete. 7 years of goldsmiths and jewelers and craftsmen of the highest order, working with materials that would make a modern jeweler weep. The base was solid gold, inlaid with thousands of precious stones, rubies, emeralds, pearls, sapphires, diamonds. The canopy overhead was fringed with pearl tassels and supported by 12 emerald-covered pillars. And at the top, so everyone in the room could see them, were 2 peacocks, their tails spread wide and fashioned entirely from gemstones. deep blue sapphires for the sweeping tail feathers, rubies and emeralds catching the light as though the birds might step down and walk away at any moment. Between the two peacocks stood a parrot, also jeweled, also breathtakingly detailed, because even in the most magnificent throne room in the world, there must be a parrot. Contemporary accounts describe the throne's total value as somewhere between 100 million and 200 million rupees in the currency of the time, a figure that historians estimate translates to something in the region of several $billion in today's money. It was not merely a seat of power. It was a statement about power, about wealth, about the divine right of a ruler who could command such a thing into existence. When foreign ambassadors entered that hall and saw the throne for the first time, the effect was entirely intentional. You were meant to be overwhelmed. For nearly a century, the Peacock Throne sat in the Diwanakot, witnessing the Durbar celebrations of emperors, the arrival of ambassadors, the slow political dramas of a civilization at its height. And then, in 1739, a man named Nader Shah arrived. Nader Shah was the ruler of Persia, brilliant, brutal, and enormously ambitious. He had already carved a path of conquest across Central Asia when the Mughal Emperor Muhammad Shah, Proved, unable to repel the Persian invasion, Nader Shah entered Delhi and unleashed something the city would not recover from for generations. His troops massacred thousands of Delhi's citizens in what historians call the Qatl-i-Am, the general massacre. The treasury was stripped, the granaries were emptied, and the Peacock Throne was disassembled, carefully packed into crates, loaded onto carts, and carried westward across the Indus River into Persia. Muhammad Shah, the Mughal emperor, is said to have wept openly as he watched it go. He had no choice. Nader Shah had taken everything. And here is where the trail becomes fascinating and painful and maddeningly incomplete. Nader Shah did not survive long enough to enjoy his treasure. He was assassinated in 1747, less than a decade after the sack of Delhi. In the chaos that followed his death, the scramble for power among his generals, the fracturing of his empire, the treasures he had amassed were scattered. Some went to his successors. Some were seized in battle. Some were hidden. The Peacock Throne itself, as a single whole object, disappears from the historical record at this point. What we know is that pieces of it almost certainly survived. Persian rulers who came after Nader Shah possessed thrones they described as the Peacock Throne, and some of these may have been reassembled from original components. There is a throne in the collection of the National Museum of Iran that some historians believe contains original Mughal gemstone work from the throne of Shah Jahan, though this is debated. The rubies and emeralds that once decorated its pillars may have been reset into other pieces of jewelry, other crowns, other objects of power, until their original identity was entirely obscured. Here is one of the quieter tragedies of colonial and conquest history. When you melt something down or disassemble it and reset its stones, you are not just destroying an object. You are destroying the story of that object. You are making it impossible for future generations to look at a jewel and know. This once sat on a peacock's tail feather in a hall in Delhi, and a heartbroken emperor watched it leave. Some of the stones that originated in the Mughal treasury, not necessarily from the Peacock Throne specifically, but from the vast wealth of that era, are now held in European royal collections, in private collections, in museum cases around the world. The provenance of many historic gems from this period is murky at best, deliberately obscured at worst. The questions of repatriation, of whether objects taken during conquest or colonial extraction ought to be returned, very much alive today and are among the most serious conversations happening in international museum communities. But beneath all of that institutional and political complexity, there is a simpler, more human dimension to the story of the Peacock Throne. It was made, it was loved, it was lost, and somewhere in the world, in a museum, in a vault, reset into a different object entirely, perhaps even buried somewhere in the vast archaeological dark, pieces of it may still exist. That possibility, faint but real, is one of the quiet heartbeats of this story. If you've ever visited a museum and found yourself standing in front of a gem or a piece of jewelry with a history that gets vague right around the 18th century, you might be standing closer to the Mughal treasury than you realize. I'd love to know, have you ever encountered an object in a museum that made you wonder about its real history? Drop a thought in the comments if you like. But for now, let us follow another thread of this story, one that is equally famous and in some ways even more contested. The Mountain of Light, the Koh-i-Noor, and its long journey. There is a diamond in the world that carries more history in its facets than most countries carry in their entire recorded past. It is not the largest diamond ever found. It is not even technically the most perfectly cut by modern standards. But it is, arguably, the most storied, the most fought over, the most wept over, the most written about, the most dreamed of. Its name is the Koh-i-Noor in Persian. It means mountain of light. The Koh-i-Noor's origins are genuinely ancient. The earliest credible historical reference to it appears in the memoirs of Babur, the founder of the Mughal dynasty, who wrote about acquiring a large diamond in 1526 after the Battle of Panipat. Babur describes a diamond that had previously belonged to the Sultan of Delhi, and his description matches the stone that would later be called the Koh-i-Noor, closely enough that most historians accept this as the same gem. If Babur's dating is correct, and if the stone truly originated in the famous Golconda mines of what is now Andhra Pradesh in India, as many historians believe, then this diamond had already been polished, traded, and admired for possibly hundreds of years before Babur ever held it. What the Golconda mines produced during their peak was extraordinary. The Collier mine, in particular, yielded diamonds of a quality and size that made the region legendary across the medieval world. The Hope Diamond, the Regent Diamond, the Orloff Diamond, the Nassak Diamond, all almost certainly came from Golconda, and the Koh-i-Noor is among the finest of them after Babur. The diamond passed down through the Mughal line, from emperor to emperor, occasionally changing hands through conquest or desperate transaction. It was in the possession of Shah Jahan, the builder of the Taj Mahal, who had it set into his famous Peacock Throne. After the collapse of later Mughal power, it passed to the Afsharid rulers of Persia. After Nader Shah's assassination and the fragmentation of his empire, it eventually made its way back east into the hands of the Afghan Durrani dynasty, and then through a series of political upheavals in the Punjab to Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the Lion of Punjab, who wore it on his arm as part of an ornamental bracelet, Ranjit Singh is said to have loved the diamond deeply and understood its symbolic weight perfectly. He reportedly said that if a stone could be thrown with full force, the ripples of the Koh-i-Noor's history would reach every corner of the earth. Whether or not he said that exactly, the sentiment rings true. When Ranjit Singh died in 1839, the Sikh Empire began to fracture. The British East India Company, always alert to political instability on its borders, moved in. By 1849, after 2 Anglo-Sikh wars, the Punjab was annexed, and in the Treaty of Lahore that formalized the annexation, one specific clause dealt specifically with the Koh-i-Noor. It stated that the diamond was to be surrendered to the Queen of England. The boy king of the Punjab at the time was Dulapay Singh. He was 10 years old. Singh was separated from his mother, converted to Christianity, and brought to England, where he became something of a curiosity at the Victorian court, an exotic young Maharaja who charmed Queen Victoria and was welcomed into her family circle. He handed the Koh-i-Noor to Victoria at a formal ceremony in 1850. By all accounts, he did not do so entirely willingly. Though the precise nature of his feelings at that moment, he was 11 years old, can only be imagined. Queen Victoria had the diamond recut. The original stone, as it had come to her, weighed 186 carats. Under the direction of Prince Albert, who felt the stone was insufficiently brilliant in its existing cut, it was recut by a Dutch jeweler named Mr. Ver. The process took 38 days and removed almost half the stone's weight. It emerged at 105.6 carats, smaller, but blazing with the kind of white fire that Victorian taste preferred. Here is something that sits uneasily in the history. The recutting of the Koh-i-Noor was, in a sense, an act of cultural erasure. The original cut of the stone reflected centuries of Indian and Persian lapidary tradition, a tradition with its own aesthetics, its own values, its own relationship between light and stone. By resetting it to European standards of brilliance, the physical object was altered in a way that severed one of its connections to its own history. What you see when you look at the Koh-i-Noor today in the crown jewels is not quite the same stone that Babur described, that Shah Jahan had set into his throne. The Koh-i-Noor now sits in the crown jewels in the Tower of London, set into a crown that was made for the late Queen Mother and which will be worn at the coronation of future Queen's consort. It is one of the most visited museum objects in the world. The governments of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran have all, at various times, made formal requests for the return of the Koh-i-Noor. The British government has consistently declined, taking the position that the diamond was acquired legally under the Treaty of Lahore. Critics of this position argue that a treaty signed under military occupation by a child who had no meaningful choice cannot reasonably be described as a legal acquisition. This is not a simple story. It never was. The Koh-i-Noor carries within it centuries of human ambition and loss, of power and its exercise, of beauty and the complicated circumstances under which beauty sometimes travels. It is a small stone. You could hold it in the palm of your hand, and yet it contains, compressed into its facets, something that feels like the weight of the world. What do you think should happen to objects like the Koh-i-Noor? It is one of the great questions of our time, sitting at the intersection of history and justice and culture. There is no easy answer, but I think it is worth sitting with the question quietly, the way you might sit with a stone itself, turning it slowly, watching the light change. What the earth swallowed, hidden vaults and buried fortunes. Not every lost treasure of the Mughal Empire was carried away on a cart or across an ocean. Some of it went in the opposite direction entirely, down into the dark, into the earth. Throughout the long decline of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century, as provincial governors grew more autonomous, as the central authority of the emperor in Delhi weakened, as invasions from the north and expanding British power from the east compressed the empire from every side, there was a recurring human response to the threat of loss. Hide it. It is an instinct as old as humanity. When things of value are threatened, and there is no safe path out, the earth becomes a vault. Across the territories of the former Mughal Empire, modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, parts of Afghanistan, local traditions and historical documents speak of buried treasuries with remarkable consistency. The stories are too numerous and too geographically spread to be dismissed as mere legend. Many of them have specific, credible details: a particular fort, a particular courtyard, a particular well. Consider the fate of many of the Mughal Empire's servitors, the provincial governors who administered vast territories on behalf of the emperor. As the empire weakened, some of these men had accumulated enormous personal wealth in land revenue, in gifts from a grateful emperor, in the proceeds of trade that passed through their territories. When the political ground began to shift beneath them, when a new power was clearly coming and their own position was becoming untenable, some of these men made the calculation that their wealth was safer underground than in transit. There are documented cases. The state archives of various Indian states contain records, some going back centuries, of treasuries known to have been buried during periods of unrest and never subsequently recovered. In Rajasthan, the region of former Rajput kingdoms that sat at the heart of Mughal-allied territory, there are stories of hidden vaults beneath old Havelis, the grand courtyard houses of wealthy merchants and minor nobles that have never been fully excavated. In some cases, the buildings themselves have long since collapsed or been built over. The treasure, if it exists, lies not merely underground, but under the foundation of someone's modern home. There is a particular category of hidden treasure that historians find compelling: the well hoard. During the 1857 uprising, the great rebellion against British rule that the British called the Indian Mutiny and Indians call the First War of Independence, there were widespread accounts of valuables being thrown into wells, hidden in the walls of houses, buried in courtyards, as people tried desperately to conceal their wealth from armies moving through their towns. After the rebellion was suppressed with great brutality, many of those who had done the hiding were dead. The locations of the caches went with them. There are occasional discoveries that suggest these stories are not all imagination. Agricultural workers in rural India periodically unearth hoards of old coins, sometimes Mughal era silver rupees, sometimes older copper coins, when digging in fields or disturbing old foundations. These finds make local news, attract archaeologists briefly, and are usually absorbed into museum collections, without fully resolving the larger questions of what else might be nearby, or what larger treasury the coins might once have belonged to. One of the most evocative of the buried treasure stories concerns the old Mughal forts themselves. The Red Fort in Delhi, the Agra Fort, the Great Fort at Lahore. These were not merely defensive structures. They were palatial complexes with hundreds of rooms, underground passages, service corridors, storage chambers. For centuries, those storage chambers held the accumulated wealth of empire, the seasonal gifts presented at court, the tribute from defeated rivals, the exotic objects brought by traders from China and Persia and Africa, the vast gold and silver reserves that allowed the empire to function as the Mughal emperors lost power in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And as the British East India Company moved to take control of these forts, there are strong historical suggestions that not everything in those chambers was catalogued, inventoried, and formally handed over. Some of it disappeared in the confusion. Some may have been hidden by loyalist servants who fully expected the situation to be reversed, who believed their emperor would return to power and would want his treasury intact. Some, almost certainly, remains in chambers that have not been accessed in centuries, if they have been remembered at all. The underground geography of the Red Fort in particular has been a subject of fascination. There are passages mentioned in historical texts that have not been fully mapped. There are areas that have not been fully excavated due to the challenges of archaeological work in and around a still-functioning monument in a living city. When the Archaeological Survey of India conducts work in these areas, it is cautious and meticulous, properly so. But the caution also means that some questions remain unanswered. The city of Agra, which was the Mughal capital before Shah Jahan moved the seat of power to Delhi, has its own subterranean mysteries. The town that grew up around the Agra fort and along the Yamuna River was wealthy for centuries, wealthy in the specific way of a capital city, where money circulates at the highest levels and concentrations of valuable objects are enormous. The city has been fought over, sacked, looted, and transformed many times since the Mughal period. And yet, archaeologists who have worked in the region note that the full depth of Mughal-era occupation has not been excavated. Things remain. There is something both beautiful and melancholy about this. The wealth of the Mughal Empire was so vast, so distributed, so embedded in the physical fabric of an entire civilization, that it could not all be taken or destroyed. Some of it simply waited, and it may be waiting still, patient as the earth itself, dark and still beneath the streets and fields and foundations of a subcontinent that has lived through extraordinary things since those coins were last touched by human hands. If you find yourself in India, wandering through an old city or past an old fort, let yourself wonder for a moment about what might be beneath your feet. History is rarely entirely in the past. Sometimes it is very close to the surface. Subscribe if you'd like to keep following these threads. There is so much more to this story, and we are only beginning to trace its shape. Pearls in the lining, the women of the Mughal court and their vanishing jewels. There is a kind of history that does not appear in battle accounts or in the formal registers of treasury inventories. It is the history of the body, of what was worn and sewn and hidden in hymns and knotted into braids and pressed into the palms of trusted servants with whispered instructions. It is the history of women navigating power and loss with the tools available to them, which were often small and brilliant and portable. The women of the Mughal court were not simply decorative figures. The Mughal imperial household, the zenana, was a world of extraordinary sophistication and considerable political influence. Empress Nur Jahan, wife of the Emperor Jahangir, effectively co-ruled the empire for years, issuing imperial edicts, commanding armies by proxy, conducting diplomatic correspondence, and amassing personal wealth that made her one of the most powerful individuals in the world of her time. Mumtaz Mahal, whose death devastated Shah Jahan so completely that he built the Taj Mahal in her memory, had been her husband's closest confidant and political advisor. The women of the Mughal inner court were educated, politically astute, often multilingual, and in possession of jewelry collections that were, in themselves, extraordinary expressions of imperial wealth. The jewelry given to Mughal women was not merely ornamental. It was also a form of portable wealth, the kind of asset that could be worn on the body, moved with its owner, and converted to other forms of value when necessary. A pair of pearl earrings, worn to court, could, in a crisis, be sewn into the lining of a garment and carried across a border. A ruby necklace could be disassembled, stone by stone, and exchanged for food, for transport, for the goodwill of strangers in dangerous times. And the times became very dangerous as the Mughal Empire declined in the 18th century. The women of the imperial and noble households faced circumstances of particular vulnerability. The fall of a dynasty is never an abstract event for the people who lived inside it. It means the collapse of the structure that gave your life its form, the end of security, the dissolution of networks of protection, the sudden exposure to a world that no longer recognizes your status. For the women of the Zenana, who had often spent their entire lives within the highly regulated world of the imperial household, this exposure was profound. There are accounts scattered in Persian and Urdu chronicles, in the memoirs of travelers, in the records of East India Company officials, of women from noble and royal households, dispersing into the city of Delhi and beyond as imperial power crumbled. Some sought shelter with distant relatives. Some placed themselves under the protection of powerful merchants. Some, in the final extremity, had nothing left but the jewels they had hidden on their persons and a determination to survive. The last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was a poet and a melancholy figure who presided over a court that had been reduced by 1857 to a small allowance from the British East India Company and a palace in Delhi that was more museum piece than seat of power. His wives and daughters were women of culture and dignity who maintained the forms of court life even as the substance of it had been stripped away. When the 1857 rebellion briefly restored some semblance of Mughal power before being crushed, the resulting British reprisals were brutal. Zafar himself was exiled to Rangoon, where he died. His sons were killed. His household was dispersed. What happened to the jewels and personal possessions of Bahadur Shah Zafar's household is a question that historians have explored with considerable interest and incomplete answers. Some were seized by British forces. Some were sold by family members in the desperate years following the rebellion, converted to cash for survival. And some simply disappeared, passed from hand to hand, dispersed into the vast, anonymous market for beautiful objects, until their origins were forgotten or obscured. There is a particular story, historical in its outlines, though exact details vary by source, of a cache of jewels belonging to one of the women of the late Mughal household being entrusted to a servant for safekeeping. As the situation in Delhi deteriorated in 1857, the servant, loyal and terrified in equal measure, wrapped the jewels in cloth and hid them somewhere in the old city. Whether the servant survived, whether the jewels were ever retrieved, whether they are still somewhere beneath the stones of old Delhi, this no one can say for certain, but it is the kind of story that repeats, in its essential shape, throughout this history. The powerful and the vulnerable both trying to protect something precious. The earth receiving what humans could no longer hold. Time doing what it always does. The jewelry traditions of the Mughal court were themselves a form of cultural expression, of breathtaking sophistication. Mughal gem-setting techniques, particularly the style known as kundan, in which gems are set directly into a foil of pure gold, without prongs or claws, produced jewelry of extraordinary delicacy and beauty. The craftsmanship required to produce a single piece was immense, weeks of work by multiple specialists, each responsible for one aspect of the process. The resulting objects were not merely valuable in a material sense. They were expressions of a culture, a philosophy of beauty, a way of understanding the relationship between light and gold and stone. Some of this jewelry has survived and lives in museum collections, most notably in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which holds a remarkable number of Mughal objects, and in the National Museum in Delhi, and in various princely collections that have been preserved in India. But this represents a fraction of what was made. Much of what was created over 3 centuries of Mughal patronage of the jeweler's art, reset, lost. If you ever find yourself looking at a piece of very old jewelry in a museum, or in an antique shop, or inherited from a distant relative, consider for a moment the hands it has passed through, the stories it has witnessed, the fear and the love and the desperation and the hope that attended its various travels through the world. Every piece of very old jewelry is also a piece of compressed history, and some of that history may be more extraordinary than we can know. The long tide going out, colonial extraction, and the wealth that left India. To understand where the wealth of the Mughal Empire went, you have to understand a process that economists and historians call the drain of wealth, a systematic, sustained, decades-long flow of resources from India to Britain. That was one of the defining economic facts of the colonial era. This is not a fringe or contested historical claim. The scale of the economic extraction from India during the period of British rule has been documented by economists of enormous reputation, most recently by UTA Sapatnik, whose research, drawing on 200 years of data, estimated that Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. Methodology behind this figure has been debated, as all large historical estimates are, but the basic direction of the argument that enormous wealth moved out of India and into Britain during this period is not seriously contested by mainstream historians. How did it happen? Not primarily through dramatic single acts of looting, though those occurred too. It happened through the mundane, accumulated machinery of economic policy. The British East India Company, and later the British Crown, controlled India's taxation. Revenue collected from Indian farmers, merchants, and manufacturers was used to purchase Indian goods, cotton, silk, spices, indigo, opium, which were then exported and sold at profit in Britain and elsewhere. The money did not return to India. It stayed in Britain, funding industrialization, paying dividends to shareholders, building institutions. But the story of lost Mughal treasure specifically involves a more direct form of transfer, the physical movement of objects. When the company's armies fought their way across the subcontinent, and they did so repeatedly and with great violence throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the treasuries of the kingdoms they defeated were seized. This was not incidental to the company's operations. It was, in a meaningful sense, the point. Military conquest was profitable, partly because conquered kingdoms had accumulated wealth. The sack of Seringapatam in 1799. When the British defeated and killed Tipu Sultan, the last independent ruler of Mysore, who had fought the British more effectively than almost anyone else in that period, resulted in the seizure of an enormous treasury. Tipu Sultan's personal possessions, his throne, his jewels, his weapons, his symbolic objects, were distributed among the officers present and sent back to Britain as trophies. Some of these objects are still in British collections today. Tipu Sultan's tiger head finials from his throne can be seen in the Victoria and Albert Museum. His automaton, a mechanical tiger mauling a British soldier, one of the most remarkable objects of the period, is also there. The looting of the Delhi Palace complex by British forces after 1857 was more chaotic and more personal than the organized company seizures of earlier decades, but no less comprehensive in its effects. Soldiers and officers helped themselves to objects from the palace and from the homes of Delhi's citizens on a massive scale. The official record-keeping was incomplete and often deliberately misleading about what had been taken and what it was worth. Objects acquired in this way entered private collections in Britain, were sold at auction, were given as gifts, were broken up for their component valuables. Lord Dalhousie, the Governor-General of India, who oversaw the annexation of the Punjab and the seizure of the Koh-i-Noor, was explicit about the economic logic of expansion. The territories the company absorbed were valuable precisely because they were wealthy, because centuries of local governance and agricultural surplus and artisanal production had created concentrations of value that the company could appropriate. The doctrine of lapse, under which Indian states with no direct male heir were absorbed into company territory, rather than passing to adopted heirs as Indian law provided, was partly a political tool and partly an economic one. When a kingdom lapsed, its treasury came with it. There is a quieter dimension to this story that is worth sitting with. The wealth of the Mughal Empire had not simply materialized. It had been built over generations through the labor of farmers and weavers and craftspeople and traders. Millions of ordinary people whose skilled hands and sustained work produced the agricultural surplus and the beautiful goods that made the empire wealthy. When that wealth was extracted, it was not only the emperors and nobles who lost. It was the entire civilization that had produced it, the craftspeople, who had woven the magnificent textiles of the Mughal court textiles, so fine that Europeans called them woven air, found that British economic policy destroyed their livelihoods in the 19th century as cheap machine-made cloth from Britain flooded Indian markets protected by tariffs that disadvantaged Indian manufacturers. the intricate knowledge embedded in those craft traditions, built up over centuries, was dispersed and in some cases lost entirely, because there was no longer a wealthy court to patronize it and no market that could sustain it. Cultural wealth, it turns out, is as vulnerable as material wealth, and its loss is, in some ways, harder to quantify and harder to recover today. Conversations about repatriation, about the return of cultural objects taken during colonialism, are among the most serious and morally complex discussions happening in international culture. Museums in Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere hold enormous quantities of objects from formerly colonized countries, acquired under circumstances that ranged from explicit looting to coercive purchase to straightforward theft. The arguments for return focus on cultural heritage, on the injustice of extraction, on the right of communities to their own history. The arguments against tend to focus on the capacity of current institutions to preserve and display objects, on the complex chains of acquisition, on the principle of universal museums. These are real arguments made by real people of good faith, and they do not resolve easily. But as you listen to this story tonight, it seems worth noting that the question is not merely academic. It connects directly to the living experience of millions of people, whose relationship to their own history was profoundly altered by events that are, in historical terms, not very long ago at all. The tide of wealth that left India during the colonial period was enormous. Some of it is visible in the great public buildings of Victorian Britain, in the financial histories of insurance companies and banks and trading houses that built themselves on the profits of colonial commerce. Some of it is in plain sight in museum cases, and some of it has been absorbed so thoroughly into the fabric of the modern world that its origins are no longer legible. But it came from somewhere. It came from the hands and fields and workshops and palaces of a civilization that built some of the most beautiful things the world has ever seen. The ones history almost forgot, lesser-known Mughal treasures and their trails. We have spent time with the famous names, the Peacock Throne, the Koh-i-Noor, the treasures that appear in history books and museum catalogs and news cycles whenever the debate about repatriation resurfaces. But the story of lost Mughal wealth is not only the story of the most famous objects. It is also the story of thousands of objects whose names we no longer know, whose trails go cold in the historical record, whose significance was perhaps local or personal rather than imperial. Let us slow down a little here and look at some of the lesser-known threads. The library of the Mughal emperors was one of the great collections of manuscripts in the world. The Mughals were passionate readers and collectors of books, not only works of history and theology, but poetry, science, mathematics, astronomy, botany. The imperial library contained texts in Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit, Turkish, and other languages, many of them illuminated with paintings of extraordinary quality. Mughal miniature painting, the art form that flowered under the patronage of the emperors, particularly Akbar and Jahangir, produced some of the most refined images in the history of painting anywhere in the world. These were not merely decorative, they were philosophical, political, personal. Jahangir, who had a passion for the natural world, commissioned paintings of birds, flowers, and animals with a scientific accuracy remarkable for the period. What happened to these manuscripts and paintings. Many are in museum collections in the British Library, the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, various private collections in Europe and America. The paths by which they arrived in those collections are not always clear and not always comfortable to examine closely. Some were legitimately purchased, some were seized, some were dispersed in the chaos of the post-1857 period. Some have been in private hands for so long that their Mughal origins have been forgotten. The British Library holds one of the most significant collections of Mughal manuscripts in the world, a fact that carries its own complicated weight. The manuscripts are extraordinarily well preserved and meticulously catalogued, and the library makes them available for scholarly study, which is genuinely valuable. At the same time, they are in London, not in Delhi or Lahore or Agra, which raises questions about who they ultimately belong to and who gets to tell the story they carry. There is also the matter of the Mughal musical tradition. The courts of the Mughal emperors were centers of extraordinary musical culture. Tanzan, the legendary musician at Akbar's court, is still revered as one of the greatest classical musicians in Indian history, and many of the ragas bearing his name are still performed today. The Mughal courts patronized hundreds of musicians, dancers, and composers, creating a musical culture of immense sophistication. Music, of course, cannot be looted in the same way a diamond can, but musical traditions can be disrupted, dispersed, deprived of patronage until they atrophy. The dissolution of the great courts that had sustained classical music traditions left many musicians without livelihoods, scattered the gharanas, the family-based lineages of musical knowledge, and in some cases broke chains of transmission that could not be fully repaired. Some of what was known in the music rooms of Mughal palaces may be genuinely lost, not stolen, but allowed to die through the withdrawal of support. Let us consider the specific case of Golconda, which was the source of so many of the famous gems we have discussed. The Golconda Sultanate, based in what is now Hyderabad, was a wealthy and sophisticated Islamic kingdom absorbed into the Mughal Empire in 1687 under Aurangzeb after a long siege. The treasury of Golconda at the time of its fall was legendary. The contemporary accounts of what was taken during that siege, the gold, the diamonds, the pearls, describe quantities that strain credibility until you remember that this was the kingdom that controlled the world's most productive diamond mines. Aurangzeb took the Golconda treasury to Delhi, where it added to the already enormous wealth of the Mughal imperial collection, which means that when the Mughal treasury was subsequently dispersed by Nader Shah, by the colonial seizures, by the chaos of 1857, within it was Golconda's fortune. Layers upon layers of accumulated wealth from multiple kingdoms. The Golconda mines themselves are another thread worth pulling. The mines produced diamonds for centuries. They were not simply locations of extraction, but centers of sophisticated lapidary culture, with craftspeople who understood how to cut and polish gems in ways that maximized their particular qualities. As the mines became exhausted in the 18th century and were supplanted by new discoveries in Brazil and later South Africa, the specific knowledge base of Golconda, the local expertise, the cutting traditions, was no longer economically necessary and largely ceased to be transmitted. Another quiet loss, invisible to outsiders. There is a category of Mughal treasure that almost never makes it into the popular imagination: the documentation. The Mughal administrative system was elaborate and meticulous. The emperors maintained detailed records of tax revenues, of court gifts, of building projects, of diplomatic correspondence. These records, known as farmans and other forms of official document, are historical objects of enormous value. Some survive in archives in India and Pakistan and Britain. Many do not. The destruction or loss of historical documentation is, in a sense, the destruction of memory itself, the erasure of the evidence. That would allow historians to reconstruct not just the facts of the past, but the texture of lives actually lived. And then there are the objects we know about only because someone wrote them down once, and that writing survived even if the objects did not. A farman from 1640 mentions a carpet made for Shah Jahan's private apartments, a carpet of such extraordinary quality that it was described in terms usually reserved for architecture. The carpet itself is gone. The document is all that remains of it. History is full of such ghosts, the record of a beautiful thing, and nothing more. Tonight, as you settle into rest, let yourself think for a moment about the idea of lost beauty. Not with sadness, or not only with sadness, but with a kind of quiet reverence. The things we have lost tell us something about the scale of what was created. A civilization capable of losing so much and still leaving behind the Taj Mahal, the Red Fort, the tradition of Mughal miniature painting, the philosophical and literary inheritance of 3 centuries of extraordinary patronage. That civilization was creating beauty on a scale almost beyond comprehension. What was taken, what was hidden, what was destroyed, these absences are their own kind of tribute to what was there. The light that stays, what remains, and why it matters. We have come a long way tonight. We have walked through the jeweled halls of the Mughal court and followed the trail of the Peacock Throne across deserts and centuries. We have sat with the Koh-i-Noor and felt the weight of all the history compressed into its facets. We have gone underground with the buried treasuries and listened for the quiet rustle of silk in the stories of the women who hid their pearls. We have looked honestly at the systematic machinery of colonial extraction and at the lesser-known losses that don't make it into the famous accounts. And now, at the end of the night, it seems right to ask, what remains? What actually survived? The answer is more generous than the losses might suggest. The Mughal Empire left an inheritance to the world that no colonial extraction could fully erase, because so much of it was embedded in stone and silk and music and language and cuisine and ways of organizing space and time that persisted in the lives of ordinary people long after the emperors were gone. The Taj Mahal remains. This seems almost too obvious to say, but its survival is not something to take for granted. It is among the most visited and most beloved buildings in the world, and it still does what Shah Jahan intended it to do. It stops the breath, it stills the mind. It insists that beauty is real and serious and worth building your life around. The Red Fort remains, though much reduced from its imperial splendor. The Agra Fort, the Fatehpur Sikri complex, that ghost city of red sandstone, abandoned by Akbar and standing almost perfectly intact in the Rajasthani plains. These are survivals of extraordinary power. The miniature paintings that did survive in museum collections around the world, and increasingly in digital archives that make them accessible to everyone, are among the finest things humans have ever made. When you look at a Mughal miniature, you are seeing a world rendered with a specificity and love that defies the distance of 4 centuries. The way light falls on a leaf, the exact angle at which a heron stands, the particular expression on the face of a courtier who knows he is being painted by someone paying extremely close attention. Classical music traditions of India, Hindustani classical music in the north, with all its connections to the Mughal court, have survived and continue to be performed and taught and transformed by living practitioners. The gharanas that were disrupted by the collapse of courtly patronage found new forms of sustenance: universities, concerts, recordings, an international audience. Ragas that were performed in the private chambers of emperors 4 centuries ago are still being explored by musicians today, still revealing new dimensions to attentive listeners. The languages, too. The Mughal Empire was a polyglot civilization, but its administrative and cultural language was largely Persian, and the synthesis of Persian and local dialects that occurred in the courts and bazaars of Mughal India eventually produced a language we call Urdu, one of the most beautiful and subtle literary languages in the world, spoken today by hundreds of millions of people across South Asia and its diaspora. Urdu poetry, which has its roots in the Mughal cultural milieu, is a living tradition of astonishing richness. Food, the cuisine of the Mughal court, the slow-cooked biryani, the kormas layered with spice and cream, the breads baked in tandoors, the sweets built on pure sugar and cardamom, persisted long after the courts that created them were gone, because it was too delicious to let die. Mughal food became the food of cities, of festivals, of celebrations. It crossed religious and community lines and became part of the shared cultural inheritance of the subcontinent. When you eat a biryani today, you are eating a dish whose essential character was developed in the kitchens of the Mughal court. That is a remarkable kind of survival. The craft traditions, though often fragmented and commercially pressured, have shown remarkable resilience. Kundan jewelry making continues in Rajasthan, passing from generation to generation in families who have practiced it for centuries. The weaving of fine cotton and silk continues in centers like Varanasi and Dhaka. The tradition of Mughal-influenced garden design, the charbagh, the 4-part garden divided by water channels, with its philosophical content about paradise and order, has influenced gardens across the Islamic world and beyond. There is something important in all of this that I want to name gently before we close. The story of the lost treasures of the Mughal Empire is, at one level, a story of loss of wealth extracted, of beauty destroyed, of history obscured. And that story is real and important and should not be minimized. The colonial period caused damage that is still being reckoned with in the present day, in economic terms, in cultural terms, in the terms of historical memory. But the story is also, and perhaps more fundamentally, a story about the persistence of a civilization's deep character. The most extractable things, the gold, the gems, the portable objects of high value, were taken. The things that were too large to move, too deeply embedded in the life of the people to be erased, too fundamental to how people understood beauty and pleasure and meaning, those remained. A civilization's real wealth, it turns out, is not primarily in its treasury. It is in the accumulated knowledge and taste and skill and imagination of its people, passing from teacher to student, from parent to child, from one generation of craftspeople to the next. The Peacock Throne is gone. The Koh-i-Noor is in London. The treasuries buried beneath old forts may never be found, but the knowledge of how to set a gem in gold so that it seems to float in light, that knowledge is still alive. The music that was played in those courts is still being played. The language in which poets praised the beauty of those jewels is still being used to write new poems. That is a different kind of treasure. And in the long run, it may be the more important one as you drift off tonight. Let that thought settle in with you. The world is full of beautiful things that have been lost to time, to accident, to deliberate destruction. But the human capacity for beauty is not lost. It renews itself in every generation, in every culture, in every hand that learns a craft, and every voice that learns a song. What the Mughal Empire built was magnificent. What it left behind in the hearts and hands and languages of the people who carry its inheritance is also magnificent and very much alive. Thank you for spending this evening with me. If this kind of history speaks to you, if you find yourself drawn to stories that look closely at the human texture of the past, at what ordinary people ate and wore and loved and feared, please subscribe and come back. There are so many more stories to tell, and I would love to tell them to you. Leave a comment if there is a particular aspect of this history you would like to explore more deeply. And sleep well. The world is old and full of wonder, and tomorrow it will still be there, waiting to be looked at with curious eyes.
And so we come to the end of tonight's story. Thank you truly for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Leave a like if this helped you relax, and share it with anyone who might need a peaceful night's rest. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What part of Genghis Khan's story stayed with you the most? What would you like to explore in future episodes? Your voice matters here. Now, let go of the day. Let go of everything that doesn't serve you in this moment. The step is quiet, the wind is soft, and sleep is waiting for you, gentle and warm. Good night, dear listener. Rest well, and I'll see you in the next story.